Ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to all of you and welcome to the Sunway Education Inclusive Leadership Series. This is the 11th edition of the Sunway Education Inclusive Leadership Series, or SEILS as we call it. Now, before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that earlier today, Professor Fernando Reimers very generously conducted a masterclass, which was well attended, and without skipping a beat, he is here joining us for this particular Inclusive Leadership Series. I believe, Professor, you were also on telly in Malaysian network Astro last night, I believe. So a very, very busy schedule indeed. We are indeed very grateful for the deeper engagement and the opportunities that have been provided. I would also like to take this opportunity to express our sincere appreciation to our partner, the Malaysian American Commission on Educational Exchange, or MACE, for collaborating with us in organizing this meaningful event. A special note of thanks goes to Ms. A.T. Abdullah, Executive Director of MACE, for reaching out and initiating this partnership. I also understand, for those of you who are not aware, barely a few hours ago there was an MOU that was signed at this very location. So in the span of about 2 hours, they turned around the venue from an MOU signing to this leadership forum. So thank you very much to our facilities team. The MOU actually marks an important milestone in strengthening academic collaboration and educational exchanges between our institutions. We also welcome Datin Norazia Binti Omar, the Undersecretary, International Relations Division from our Ministry of Higher Education. Thank you also for joining us this afternoon. Ladies and gentlemen, this afternoon's session continues that very important conversation, focusing on how universities can remain relevant in a rapidly changing world that is shaped by climate change and artificial intelligence. Please allow me to introduce our speaker, if you have not already had the privilege of meeting him this afternoon. Our guest for today is Professor Fernando Reimers. Professor Reimers is the Ford Foundation Professor of the Practice in International Education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education and Director of the Global Education Innovation Initiative at Harvard University. He is widely recognized for his work on education policy, global citizenship education, and advancing systems-level change in education to meet the demands of a rapidly evolving world. Today, our theme is how to make universities more relevant, the climate change and AI nexus. It is also my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Professor Dato Elizabeth Lee, Group CEO of Sunway Education. Professor Dato Elizabeth Lee has been instrumental in shaping Sunway Education's vision and growth and brings with her deep experience in higher education leadership. We are indeed very privileged to have her guide the next segment of this evening's or this afternoon's session. Professor Dato, may I pass the session over to you? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Paul Linus Andrews. He's not just our MC. Paul does a lot of things for us. He's also the director at the Group CEO's office. Thank you, Paul. So, Professor Reimers, we are indeed very privileged and happy to have you here with us. And I understand that we have about 1 hour, and then you have to rush all the way back down to Kuala Lumpur for your next engagement. So we will shoot straight to it, shall we? As you all heard, Professor Fernando Reimers is an expert when it comes to education policy, and especially in this changing era of AI and most importantly, climate change, sustainability, and all the things that we like to talk about and we profess, but I'm just seriously wondering if we are doing very well. So my first question, sir, would be, in your vast experience as you travel around the world and you look at universities, including our own today, have you actually come across a university which has genuinely succeeded or is succeeding at translating research into real-world impact, especially on something which is as urgent as climate action or AI governance?
AI, first of all, thank you for hosting me here, and thank you all so much for coming. I'm delighted to be with you this afternoon. The world is a rich laboratory of innovation in higher education, and I think that there are a lot of very important things happening in universities in enhancing and making visible their social impact. Among other reasons, because in many societies, the trust that traditionally the public had placed in universities is declining. And so that, I think, causes universities to make an effort to make more visible what is it that they do for society, or to be more intentional in making sure that they actually add value to society, not only through the research that they carry out and through their students, which is of course a way to have impact. And I do think that there are a number of observatories that can tell us who innovates. I've served for a decade, a bit less, in the board, in the advisory group that the Times Higher Education puts together to examine innovation in Asian universities. And that observatory tells me that universities such as yours and others are actually doing very good work in terms of sustainability, trying to have sustainability. So I think that success here is not a discrete event. You have succeeded or not, it's a process. Are they embracing sustainability as a goal? Are they engaged in activities that are aligned with promoting sustainability? The answer is yes. More generally, beyond sustainability, AI is more recent, and I haven't yet looked at what universities are doing with AI to have an informed view on that question, but I have just published a book last January examining how AI is being used to support education system transformation in the global south, and I can have views on that subject. And I do think, by the way, that universities could be a very good partner to education systems that we deploy AI to address the necessary transformation of education systems and to put guardrails into some of the potential risks. I can tell you that one of the conclusions of that book is that at the moment, the uses of AI at the K-12 level are augmenting pre-existing inequalities rather than helping to close them. So without corrective action, we can anticipate a set of greater inequalities in education than the ones that existed prior to AI.
As you mean the ones who know how to use it versus the ones who don't?
And because of the uses. And I suspect, although I haven't systematically studied that, but from my own experience in higher education, I suspect that at the moment, this is also happening within universities and across universities. Let me explain. In my own university, over the last 3 years, the philosophy of the university, the policy has been to encourage everyone to experiment with AI.
Yes.
And so they have made available to all faculty, to all students, to all staff, access to 8 premium editions of large language models. And they have provided plenty of opportunities for professional development. So just the last semester, I was in 2 groups with a lot of very good support, coding agents and basically redesigning my courses so that they are enhanced with Socratic tutors in which the students can, in various ways, demonstrate that they can apply what they're learning before they come to class for a conversation. I do know that similar support is not being offered in all the universities, even in Massachusetts. And I also know from my uses of AI, some of these agents in the classroom, that what I observe, these are early days, I've only been doing this for the last year, what the use of these Socratic tutors seems to do is to increase inequalities, is to produce a group of students who are ready for conversations at a much higher level in Bloom's taxonomy than would have been the case. But also there are now more students that are quiet than used to be the case than before. So it's early days. I haven't studied this systematically, but I suspect that in higher ed, there is a similar pattern taking place than in K through 12, with a caveat perhaps that universities certainly have access and have more resources to offer more support to faculty in using it. I think it will take less time for most universities to make it possible for their faculty to be doing the kinds of experiments that we're doing than for K-12 system, to provide that opportunity to all their teachers, particularly across schools that represent different quality tiers, right?
I think we have moved quite a fair bit in academia, in school. I mean, at one point, academics, teachers were very concerned about, the young ones using AI in the classroom or to do their work. There was a lot of, I wouldn't call it fear, but basically how we're going to test the students, etc. However, I'm beginning to see that there is a change as the academics themselves are using AI to help enhance what they are doing and perhaps improving on what they are even writing, helping with research, etc. What do you think is now the ratio between staff usage of AI versus students?
So I think the answer depends on the level of the education system. I think your description reflects very well the process we have undergone at Harvard. I shouldn't say Harvard, I should say the School of Education, because Harvard is a very large institution.
Yep.
But I can certainly say that in my school, 3.5 years ago, our initial response to the introduction of AI was to ban it, because we were concerned that our students, that this was going to diminish the educational experience. But it didn't take us very long to stay in that stage, in part because there was a very strong push from what we call the center, from the central leadership of the university, in saying, no, we want us to experiment with AI, not to shy away from it. And we're in that stage. It's still early stages. For example, one of the areas that we have not solved at all is the area of how do we assess competencies in an age of AI. So the initial responses that I have seen are to go back to the examination in the classroom. But as you know well, in an examination, there are certain cognitive skills that are easier to test than others. And to some extent, they represent a going back to relative to the kinds of skills that you can measure with a research project or with a consulting project for a real client and so on. So we're still trying to figure out many of these questions of how do we build coherent systems that really augment the capacity of the student rather than diminish it. But I don't think that description characterizes what is happening in public education systems at the elementary and secondary level. The conclusion of our book, which is a study, and I should qualify, we finished writing that book September of last year. So it's almost been a year now. A year is a very long time in AI. So what I'm about to say is probably dated, but as of September of last year, the situation was one where what we did in that book was to distinguish between the concept of innovation and transformation. Innovation is to create something interesting with AI.
Yep.
We don't need to do a study to know that we're going to be able to do a lot of innovations with AI. Transformation is different. Transformation is, can we deploy AI to solve the main problems of public education systems? And those problems can be grouped in 3 categories. Problem number 1, 250 million students around the world don't go to school. Problem number 2, of the children who go to school, about half don't understand what they read in grade 4th. Problem number 3, a lot of what they're learning in school is actually not going to help them improve their opportunities in life. And so essentially, access, efficacy of the system, and relevance of the system. So we use that lens to examine how what AI could do potentially, given what it's doing in other sectors, what AI was actually doing, use cases, what the evaluations that existed about those use cases showed, and then we drew implications for policymakers, practitioners, researchers, and developers, and then raised a bunch of ethical questions. The high-level summary is most of the action with AI in the global south is in developing student-facing bots. But there are a lot of missed opportunities. If you think about an educational system, in my view, tremendous potential of AI is improving the governance of the system. Basically, for example, I'm sure that in Malaysia, as in most education systems, when a teacher leaves their post, there is a time that goes by until a replacement comes to that school. And the duration of that period is directly proportional to the distance between that school and the Ministry of Education, which means that the most disadvantaged schools very often have to wait months until a replacement teacher comes in, and very often that replacement is not in the field of study in which the teacher is needed. Now, this is a very easy problem to solve with AI. I mean, it's a straight information system problem. One of the things that education systems traditionally are not very good at is listening to people who are closer to instruction, to their teachers. AI and modern means of communication make it possible to listen in real time. What is it that teachers are saying? For example, in Malaysia, you have launched a very ambitious reform that is going to get everybody in school a year earlier, and that is going to require everybody to have 3 additional years of compulsory schools. I would imagine it's of the essence in this reform to get some sense of what the people in the front lines think. And this is totally within reach. So these are just 2 examples of the ways in which AI can be deployed to improve the governance of the system. You could build predictive models where, based on the information you have about every student, you could say, who's at risk of dropping out? And how do we identify them early so we can intervene early? And yet we found very few use cases of that sort. Similarly, AI could be used to provide teachers or people who support teachers to improve the capacities of skills. So almost, if you take a pyramid of an education system and you put at the top the ministry, policy making, you have the middle tier of administration, you have the school principals, you have the teachers, you have the students. Most of the action is student facing, which is going to increase inequality because there are big divides in access to connectivity and devices. So the fact that most of the action is student facing is exacerbating inequality. A lot of the action, which could improve the enabling conditions to get the system to provide better access, effectiveness, and relevance, is still not happening. And so I think this low-hanging fruit for universities such as Sunway. I understand you already have partners with schools. I imagine you have faculty who have an interest in AI. So you could actually work in solving some of these problems and redressing some of those imbalances.
Why do you think there is this lag?
This lag in terms of the K-12 versus universities?
No. As in, we just identified what AI can do for the schools, right? And for the front-facing students, for example, and when you don't have a teacher. But we're not really using AI to do that.
Correct.
Why do you think is the case?
I have a theory, and the theory is that very often in education, innovators solve problems that they imagine people should have, as opposed to solving problems people have. So let me give you an example. In Brazil, 2 years ago, with some colleagues, we surveyed a sample of teachers, and we asked them, what are the biggest challenges that you have you wish you had a superpower to solve? We coded them, we took the first 10 problems. They could all be solved, not with AI, with technology. They could all be solved. At the same time, you look at the applications that vendors are trying to sell ministries. And many ministries are struggling to understand, is this solving my problems? And they lack a framework to help them understand what to adapt. So I think one explanation is this mismatch between what is being developed and the existing needs. So even though people talk about co-design, which I think is a principle for AI, a lot of that talk is performative. It's not real co-design. I'll give you an example of real co-design. A group brought together a group of school principals from various countries in Latin America for 3 days. You could do this in Malaysia tomorrow. And on the first day, they got them to identify what are the biggest problems that you have. So principals said, my problem is I don't have any time to sit in classrooms and observe instruction because all my time is consumed largely writing memos, oftentimes about the same thing to 5 different constituencies. So day number 1 was about establishing what are the problems. Day number 2 was teaching them basic prompt engineering. Day number 3 was code some solutions to your problems. So now you converted the teacher who tells you, we bring a new initiative and I have to communicate to 5 stakeholders, I have to write 5 memos, and that is a task that is going to consume 70, 90 minutes out of my week. So you now converted that into a 15-minute task. So a second order effect, the innovation here is not to use AI to help you write 5 memos out of 1. The innovation is to free up the time and then to put that time in service of instructional leadership. That's an example of the kind of second order effect we don't have. So why isn't that happening at scale? Because not enough people are doing the same thing. Bring the people who have the problem and make them be co-designers of the solution. That's one explanation for why we have this mismatch between solutions and problems.
So you're also in a way saying that if we actually got together more often and talked about our problems, and we can actually co-design the solutions,
Yeah.
does that mean then this is not going to be very lucrative for potential vendors?
So that is a very good question, and I think it's a real challenge with AI. I mean, there are many, many challenges with AI, but the fact that we are in a race to build the super AI, and that race, for the most part, is basically in the hands of corporations who have an obligation to their shareholders primarily.
Absolutely, yeah.
Primarily, I think that is something we should be concerned about, because we do know that the reason we were able to get access to 8 premium editions of AI and make them available to everybody is because all these companies are heavily subsidizing those products. So the moment there is a winner in that race and they decide to charge the true cost of that AI or the cost plus the profit, I imagine that this is not going to solve the problems of inequality I am describing. So that issue, the issue of the regulation of AI and the consideration of how do we build some public goods with AI that are accessible, that have a double bottom line, not just an obligation to shareholders, is a real concern, I think.
And open source is not really helping that solve that problem at all.
Well, I don't know that it's happening yet. I mean, OpenAI was going to be OpenAI, but it's a company now.
Yeah,
that is not
exactly.
OpenAI. Yeah.
And everything that's open, I mean, nowadays we still have to sign on, whether it's with your Facebook account or your Google account or your, your email.
Yeah, there's a whole
there must be some
universe
way,
of dilemmas we haven't examined. I can tell you that as a result of using these agents in my own teaching, I now have access to information about my students I wouldn't have before. I now know when I'm looking at them, who's actually done the homework and who hasn't. I haven't yet acted on that knowledge, but I could. And as I listen to the student, I listen differently to the student that I know has really prepared and the one that hasn't. And so there are ethical questions, right? What does it mean to be in a class where your professor can look into your mind and can see whether you're prepared or not? So there are new questions that we'll have to grapple with, as I don't think we really have a choice over using AI or not. I don't imagine that we're going to say, let's ban this technology. But I imagine we're going to have to work on guardrails, just like we put guardrails on nuclear energy. This is a very powerful technology. It allows us to do a lot of good things and also to cause a lot of harm. And we're not spending enough time thinking through the ethical questions about the use of AI in various fields of activity, including the fact that these technologies can have so much information about individuals. So the question of should a teacher, should a professor have access? I mean, I could envision a time in which the university would be in a position to integrate a lot of information about a single student.
You don't think it is really a fearful myth? As in, I know in the past when I've said that, people say, what is your field of study? And I say psycholinguistics, and they kind of look at me, what does it mean? I said, it means maybe I can read your mind. And it's amazing that people actually believe you. Of course I can't do that, you know what I mean? It's ridiculous. And it's just very fancy, it sounds fancy. Just like with AI, you could have all that information, but it doesn't mean that you can you can actually know for sure whether he prepared for your class or not. You know what I mean? You can guess, but because the human being is so complex, we could just, most of the time, I would say, surprise.
Yeah, I mean, I hope we continue to be surprised. So as you know, for the last 20 years, there have been companies gathering every possible data point available on individuals. And for the most part, using that information to build tools for marketing purposes. So I know in the US 20 years ago, those companies had 800 data points on me and every other person in the US, and they could use that to do micro-targeting, which was fine until after 9/11, the government said, why don't you tell us who's likely to be a terrorist? And for the first time, we had to grapple with the question that the criminal system had to make judgments about individuals, not about crimes that they had committed, but about crimes that they could commit based on some predictive models.
Yeah.
That was 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And so it's only gotten more powerful today. What I think is different is that at that time, access to that information was only granted to the individuals who were able to pay for it, which meant not most people. So to some extent, that leveled the playing field. But I think what is changing now is that more individuals are going to have access maybe to more than 800 data points about each one of us. So I think the dilemmas are real about what does privacy mean in an age of AI. Who should have access to our medical records at a time when that information sits on a cloud somewhere, and it really is not private. If
Of
it
course
is
it's
on
not.
the cloud somewhere,
Yes.
someone can have access to
Yes,
that.
I'm always very sure. So, when you have all these blackmailers to then tell you, I have access to all your accounts,
So, for
okay, if you
example,
can transfer all my money out now, I'm concerned. But if you can't, I really can't be bothered because, if someone were to kidnap me, at least I know I can be found quite easily because of all this information out there.
So,
And I should
on
be
that
frightened.
issue that you mentioned last week, I don't know if you use Canvas or not, but many of my students
Yes,
receive
exactly.
a message
Canvas, yeah.
saying you need to pay us a certain amount,
That's
or you
right.
won't have access to your grades. And others were scrambling because it was the end of the semester. How do I grade my students? How do I submit final grades? How do they graduate if we now have put all those records on the internet? And so anyway, these are, so far a little bit the terrain of science fiction and speculation, but they are a brave new world for sure in many domains. At the same time, I think we should focus on all the potential, all the good that AI can do, which I think is a lot, in helping us develop new competencies among our students, I'll give you an example. In a course I teach on educational policy, I'll give you an example, one class. Students used to study a well-documented education reform over 20 years for 2 different countries, and then they read a series of conceptual papers to think about how do you design a reform so it can be implemented. So now, one of these agents has been coded to be the Minister of Education of Poland in the year 2000, and to engage with the student as an advisor, and the instructions are, ask questions of the student based on what happened in the reform, do not provide an answer, and at the end of a cycle of Q&A, provide feedback to the student in terms of how well they have studied the case, how well they're using the frameworks. And I think that's amazing that we can do that. We can also use AI to teach students to do something that very sophisticated leaders do, but most people don't, which is to see a complex problem through the eyes of multiple people, right? So we know that complex challenges, whether they are globalization or climate change, are not just one thing. There are 5 or 10 different things at the same time, and what they are to some extent, or what they mean for you, depends on where you sit in the world, where you sit in the social structure, and so on. So now you can code 10 different personas, and you can say, let's take data on predictions of impact of climate change in Malaysia next year. And then you can say, well, if you are a farmer, what does that mean for you? If you live in Kuala Lumpur, what does that mean for you? And using that as part of the education of students, teaching them to see complex problems through the eyes of different people is something we couldn't do before, and it's very valuable.
Yep. Yes, absolutely. In fact, I'd like to shout out to my colleagues here from the Jeffrey Sachs Center, the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network. They're here, hoping very much. And do I have anyone here also from our Center for Planetary Health? My colleagues here? We have actually 2 centers, the Jeffrey Sachs Center for Sustainability and Management, and also we have the Center for Planetary Health here on Sunway. the university has these 2 thriving centers,
I'm delighted.
and it just goes out to show how committed we are to this, this whole agenda of making sure that we save our planet, etc. Now, I'm going to ask you, since we have also a lot of people here very interested in sustainability, how well are we doing in that area? I don't mean Sunway University specifically. I mean we as in, globally.
So I am delighted to have seen your visible commitment to the Sustainable Development Goals, because I think they are an ambitious, no doubt, aspirational framework of what it means to build a sustainable goal. We know, since the goals were adopted in 2015, that these were ambitious goals, and many people knew that in all likelihood we would not achieve them in 15 years. I mean, a world without poverty, it's a wonderful aspiration, but to think that we can produce that in 15 years? So I am very pleased to see that your university and others around the world have embraced the SDG as a North Star and have then asked the question, what does it mean to educate students in various disciplines, in various professions, to not only understand those goals and why they matter, but to care about them and to have the skills to do something to advance that world. I think in that sense, we're doing much better than we were before we had the SDGs. I think that there is a lot of progress in making progress towards the SDGs. As you know, the Global Monitoring Education Report that UNESCO puts out, it's actually the Secretariat to keep track of how we're doing with respect to the targets.
Yes.
And I think the answer is there is a lot of progress towards the achievement of the goals, especially with targets set out by the same governments. At the same time, you can say, and they will not be achieved, and they will not be achieved as intended. Which begs the question then, what should replace them? So if it were up to me, I would stick with the SDGs. I hear these rumblings that we're all fascinated with human flourishing. It sounds nice. I don't know what it is.
Human what?
Flourishing.
Human flourishing.
So a lot of people are talking that human flourishing is going to be the next development agenda. I wish I understood what human flourishing means. I hope it means something like the SDGs. In other words, it means not only that individuals will flourish, but that they will flourish in making their communities spaces where everybody can flourish. And I think that's the beauty of the SDGs, is that recognition of the interdependence of progress. It's the same recognition of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that I cannot flourish if I don't help you flourish, and if we don't help the least advantaged person flourish. So back to your question, how well are we doing? We're making progress. We're making progress towards the SDGs. We will not achieve the SDGs by 2030. I think we should continue to make progress. We should have more universities learn from what universities like Sunway are doing, learn what does it mean to take these goals seriously, and to find ways in all your programs of study to help your students not only recite the SDGs, that's not important, to help them deeply understand what is poverty, what are the root causes of poverty, how does that connect to what you can do in whatever area and field of activity you choose to be, right?
Now you have AI on one hand, and you have the SDGs, you have the doomsayers, which who say that the world is coming to an end, and you also have people who are really watching the numbers very, very carefully, especially the temperature numbers, as to whether global warming is real or not, and how much are we warming, and how quickly, etc. Now, you would have thought that with AI, and it would be able to predict for us how long will it take before our planet dies.
So you ask a very good question, which is, are we making progress towards containing emissions at the necessary speed? Are we going to meet those targets? And I think the answer to that is no. We know it's not. But it's not because it cannot be done, but because a number of countries have retreated from a commitment to tackling climate change. And I think universities and others should spending more time understanding why is that? What are the drivers? Why is it that today there is less commitment to zero emissions than there was 5 years ago? What's the connection between the rise of these ethno-nationalist movements that are telling us abandon the commitment to international cooperation as a path to stability and instead build your military as a path to achieving your goals? I think we should be studying that, and we should be making that a subject of public conversation. I will confess something to you. On Monday of last week, Springer published this new book called Education for a Climate Change World, which I co-authored with my former student, Margaret Wan.
Buy that book, guys.
It's free, you don't need to buy it. You can download it for free. Just Google that title, you can download it. We spent 3 years on that book. At the end of the first year, I had not become very hopeful that we were going to solve this problem, because I realized that the timescales involved in understanding climate are so different than the timescales that most of us are educated to understand. We really are educated to function on very short timescales. And so to think 30, 100 years down the road, not to talk 500 years, is to some extent contrary to how we are trained to think. And I became a little hopeless, and I said, maybe I shouldn't write this book because I'm not sure we're going to solve this problem. But I'll tell you how I was able to solve the problem by inviting my former student who took a class with me in which I designed an approach to teach about climate change that in her case changed the course of her career. She decided to create an organization, a social enterprise, that works with teachers and schools, mostly in the United States, helping them develop climate change curriculum. And I said to Margaret, I need you to help me finish this book because you're going to be more hopeful that we can solve this problem than I am at the moment. And she did help me finish the book and strike the right balance.
But how many Margarets are there out there?
Well, I think we can create opportunities to produce more people like Margaret. I'll give you an example. The course that she took, and there are small actions that can have big effects. In fact, I just 2 days ago wrote an email to a former president who, exactly 10 years ago, invited me to a convening of this sort at Harvard, at which she had invited climate scientists to share with us the science. And I confessed that I ignored her email, and she wrote again. She said, I see you have not responded. I really would like for you to come to this meeting. And as I sat through that 2-day meeting, I kept wondering, why did Drew want me to sit through a meeting where I don't understand 80% of the chemistry and the physics that is being presented? And my one takeaway from that meeting was, no wonder we have a problem. These scientists are mostly talking to each other. They're not making any effort to talk to the public. They certainly aren't making any effort to talk to the education system. Right. So I walk out of that meeting a little bit more curious about climate. And then the succeeding president put together a committee, and he invited me to that committee. He said, I want you to help develop a climate education strategy for the university. And I learned a lot from the work on that committee over a year from my colleagues who knew a lot more than I did. And the result of that was that I said, okay, I'm going to take my course in policy, and in that course, give students an opportunity to learn more about climate change education. And what I did was very simple. Develop a very simple protocol. I told those students, you're going to find a partner somewhere in the world, an NGO, a government. In that place, you're going to, it's going to be a partner that cares about climate education. You're then going to identify what are the disruptions that climate is creating in that place. You're then going to identify what are the human actions that would help adapt or mitigate. And then you're going to figure out what is the best education program to help people engage in that kind of action. And they did that over a semester. So what that did, and what my main goal was not to solve the problem in the places they were working. They made a contribution, was to help the students discover that they could do something about it. Then we published the work of the students in a book. And in writing the introduction of that book, I read the evaluations of existing climate change curriculum. And what I found that surprised me is that 80% of those evaluations show that climate change education curriculum is ineffective from the point of view of developing hope and developing the belief that you can do something about it. They're effective in teaching you the climate, the science, but they're not effective in teaching you to believe that now you might say ignorance is bliss, maybe because people become hopeless because they understand the problem better. There's only one person I have found, a Swedish researcher, Maria Ojala, who has spent her career studying the emotions of climate, the emotions of understanding climate. And she has done experiments of this sort. She takes groups of high school students, she takes half of them, and they take a one-semester course in climate science. And she takes the other half and they take the same course, but they also work on an action project where they do something about climate. And she measures before and after knowledge, emotions towards climate, hopelessness or hope, and belief that they can make a difference. You can anticipate her findings. Both groups learn the science equally. Only the second group develops some hope that they can do something about it. To some extent, it shouldn't surprise us, right? You can build efficacy. What she's measuring is efficacy, the belief that you can do something. You develop efficacy much more when you engage students in some kind of project-based thing than when they sit passively and they listen to a bunch of lectures. That's what she's doing with her second group. But what is interesting is that most of the climate, that's one of the findings of our book, most of the climate education programs are not doing what she's doing, they're teaching the science. So they're counterproductive. They are teaching people to be hopeless, that they can do something about this problem. So again, that's a reminder of the power of universities to take stock of what is known, to advance what is known, and to then use that to engineer programs that are hopefully a little bit more effective in transforming education systems.
Thank you very much. Most thought-provoking. While AI may be able to predict when the world would end, but at the same time, because human beings are resilient enough, human beings are hopeful enough, and so at some point, that just makes it all the more difficult to predict. Am I right?
I hope you're right. I hope that we have human agency for a long time. I think that that's the world I have grown up used to living in, a world in which humans are free, in which there is freedom.
Yeah. So, ladies and gentlemen, may I open up the floor? I'm sure that Professor Reimers has piqued your interest and your curiosity and your own thoughts. Would you like to share some of your own thoughts and questions? Richard. Richard is on our board of governors for the Modern College School in Sunway.
Hello, thank you. Thank you very much for a thought-provoking talk here. So I personally think that formal invigilated examinations are becoming ever more important in the age of AI. Because if I set coursework for my students, more often than not, they all tend to ace it. However, I have a good feel for the students that I teach. And what I find is that more often than not, despite all the deficiencies with exams, my best students do well in exams and the weaker students do more badly, as it were. What are your thoughts on this? Because I get the impression you're a big advocate of AI.
I actually am optimistic but agnostic as to what AI is going to do. I think it's early days. We do not know. I will share this with you. In 1980, I bought my first computer. It was a computer produced by Radio Shack. It was basically a small CPU. You can code in BASIC in that program. And I was then finishing an undergraduate degree in instructional psychology. And I coded a little clown that could teach you math, that could personalize math. And I did my undergraduate thesis on instructional psychology, and I said these devices, which were totally new at the time, are going to transform education. Everybody's going to. And I was wrong. If you look at the last 40 years since, for the most part, education is not very different than what it was. And I would say that in spite of the fact that we have a lot of technologies which have been developed since, a lot of instruction still looks the way it used to. Here I am sitting on stage, here you are, all looking at me, I'm talking, you're listening, you have a few times to ask some questions. Not very different from the way I taught when I started teaching in 1982. So if I had to assess did technology transform education, I would say no, most promises were unfulfilled. And there's a very real possibility that the same will be true with AI, that AI will be a big disappointment. That's why in this book that we finished, we said, I'm not interested in whether we can code little clowns with AI. I'm interested in whether we're using it to transform. The problems that education systems have are real. The problem that 250 million kids can't set foot in a school is a problem for humanity. The problem that half of those who get into a school can't understand what they read is a problem. So I hope that if we deploy AI, if we experiment with it, it'll be in service of those goals. So that's my stance. And I began that book saying, let me look at the evidence. I'm open to changing my mind on the basis of evidence. I'm even open to considering the possibility that we will learn from our failure the last 4 decades of actually use technology to solve real problems, and maybe we'll do better this time. But if the historical record is of any use, the logical prediction is that we're going to miss the opportunity with AI. As to the premise of your question, which is that examinations are here to stay, I'm also open-minded about that. I don't know, because I think that the kinds of skills that we know how to measure with examinations, this could change, are a very small fragment of the set of skills we need. We still need knowledge. We still need memorization. We still need facts. But we need a lot more than that. And one of the things that I observe, if you teach, I'm sure you observe that too, is a real generational shift. And I see in the younger generation, beginning 7 to 10 years ago, serious shortcomings in interpersonal skills. I mean, real shortcomings, like the ability to read nonverbal clues, like the ability to really collaborate in teams. There is something, I believe, that the immersion in these social platforms has caused that has had a debilitating effect in the capacity of people to read a book, in the capacity of people to sit through an hour lecture and follow the argument and pay attention. So we cannot measure those things with examinations, I'm afraid. So I think we're going to have to work on figuring out, on agreeing what knowledge is important and how to assess it. One of the most helpful things that I have read in helping me think about what knowledge is important is a book published 2 years ago by the 3 professors at Berkeley, a physicist, a philosopher, and a social psychologist. And the name of the book is Third Millennium Thinking. I really recommend this book to any of you in education. When I read the book, I sent a copy to my president. I said, we should read these because we're not teaching these skills. And these are the skills that would matter. What are they? The capacity to think of future scenarios in terms of probability. I think the reason most people don't understand climate change is because they think about prediction as 0 or 100%. And of course, that's wrong. If you read the International Panel on Climate Change report, it's about understanding scenarios and probabilistic thinking. Anyone who's engaged in future scenarios understands that. But that's not the vast majority of the population. It's not even the vast majority of world leaders. Maybe that's why we have a retrenchment from an interest in climate change. Maybe that's why some people can say climate change is a hoax. The scientists can't agree. I've heard global leaders say that. It's an unfortunate statement.
We know who the global leader is.
It's an unfortunate statement that reflects a profound ignorance in understanding what scenarios are. So anyway, I think we're going to have to rethink assessment. I don't think that just going back to examinations is going to get us out of the quandary we're in.
In the first place, what are examinations for?
I think all assessments have three goals. One goal is to help the person designing instruction to learn how you're doing.
Yes.
The second goal is to help the person learning know how they're doing.
Yes.
And the third goal for some examinations is to convey to other parties what the person knows and can do. And so that formative and summative function of assessment sometimes are complicated. So I tend to think of the assessment that I do mostly as having a formative value. That's why I have no problems giving my students C's and D's, because I think you learn a lot from a C well earned or a D well earned. And you don't learn very much from a bunch of fake A's, where people think your self-esteem is going to suffer if you don't get the highest grade. But my students remind me that the grades are not just a signal to them. They're a signal to the admissions committees of the next program that they want to apply to. They believe they're a signal to employers. I tell them, no employer is going to ask for your transcript, he's going to look at your grades. But I think it's a balance, right, between that formative and summative function of assessments.
So when you say assessment versus examinations, for example, so if that is exactly what we are looking for, looking to achieve, then is there some other way to get to that destination?
I mean,
that result.
Is there another way to assess?
Yes, yeah.
Of course. I mean, I'll give you an example. In the course I teach on education policy, I ask the students, the assignment which they have to take from day one is they have to consult in teams for a government at a national, state, or local level. They have to negotiate with that government what problem, an education problem, they're going to try to solve. And they learn to do policy analysis over a semester, solving that problem. I can tell you that the task is intimidating to some students at the beginning of the semester because they have never been put in that position where they realize that the stakes are high, that these governments, for example, during COVID, we were advising governments around the world on how to sustain educational opportunity. I also tell the students, if you do a very good job at the end, I will invite you to present your papers at a conference at which I'm going to invite real leaders of practice. And then if you do a great job at a conference, I will invite you to turn your paper into a chapter and we'll publish it into a book. But they all know that not everybody's going to be invited to the party. Not everybody's going to present at the conference, not everybody's going to publish. And they respond to the challenge the way anyone who's in a competitive sport enjoys this challenge and understands that sportsmanship requires that sometimes you win, sometimes you don't win. So that's an example of how you can assess. I can tell you, I have a former student here, Ayati. She can tell you, Ayati, who was your client for your project in my class? Who?
ASEAN
The ASEAN Secretary. So she can tell you what that project did for them. Very often the students will tell me that experience, the experience of actually giving advice to a government, changed how I saw myself. And that's the point, right? The experience of seeing my work published in a book changed how I saw myself. And that's the point, right? So yes, there are different ways to assess. I teach another class on educational innovation in which students design a business plan for a social enterprise or for a company. So they basically come to that class. So I'll show the difference. I used to teach a class on education, poverty, and inequality, a subject I care deeply about. But it was your usual class in which they read Bourdieu and Passeron, a lot of sociology. And the course had the effect of depressing me and the students. Because there are some problems that if you think very hard about them, you wonder, can we really solve it? And then one year, I had developed with some of my colleagues a program at Harvard called the Advanced Leadership Initiative. You know about the program. We bring people who have retired from a primary career. And so for that program, I had put together a team. We had done a series of case studies of social entrepreneurs that were creating effective educational opportunities in high poverty contexts. So the last time I taught my course in poverty, I took the last third of the course and I inserted all these cases, and that's what we studied instead of reading sociologists. And I observed that the students were a lot more animated, more awake, more alive. Of course. And so was I. And so I finished teaching that course and I said, I'm going to retire that course in which I assessed my students in exams, assessing how well they could tell me what the ideas of all these sociologists were. And I said, the class is now going to be a class in which your ticket of admission is that you have a problem that you care enough about that you're going to solve it. And what you're going to do in the class is you're going to develop a solution and a business plan to create an enterprise that can help you implement that solution. And so that's the class I now teach. And so, yes, I do think there are different ways to assess.
Thank you for that message. And I hope that the teachers amongst us, the lecturers amongst us, will take that message and think through about assessment and, and why we need all those exam halls, Professor Simran, for example. Yeah. Sorry, we have a question here.
We have three questions.
Oh, we
I
have
think.
three. Okay.
I'm going to stop it at the three for now because I'm mindful of Professor's timing. So.
And if you could try to speak close to the mic. I was having a very hard time hearing you, even though I have my hearing aids. So speak very close to the mic so I can hear you well.
Thank you. A few years ago, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, Rockefeller Foundation came to Kuala Lumpur and held a climate change conference for 2 days. I was invited, and then we listened to them and debated them. And then I learned that President Trump was not keen. He doesn't believe in it. In climate change, you need a global cooperation. So basically, there was no political will. We can't even solve the tobacco problem, let alone solve global climate. Tobacco kills 8 million people yearly, and no country has ever tried to ban tobacco. 2 weeks ago, I attended a tobacco conference in Kuala Lumpur. There's no effort to ban tobacco. What they are telling is, you can import tobacco and we'll try to control it. That's silly. You said that China has lifted 8 million people out of poverty.
Sorry, can I interrupt? Do you have a question? We are mindful of time as Professor has to leave and we have 2 more guests. If you could just get to the question and maybe we'll take the 3 questions together.
Okay, how do you compare AI in US and China? And what do you think of Edward Snowden?
I have not studied AI in China, nor have I studied AI in the US, so I can't have an informed view on that subject. But I do think that to your earlier point, of course, what political leaders believe is important. In democratic societies, what political leaders do very often reflects the demands from their constituents. So we ought to be as concerned with educating political leaders as we ought to be with educating the larger public. It may be a little bit different in societies that are not democratic, where what is most important is what the leaders think. But I can tell you that in America, leaders are elected because the majority of the population identify with the ideas that those leaders present. I am right now working on a book. One of the things that I became very curious about as I finished that book on climate change that was published last week is the connection between political developments and interest in both global citizenship education and climate change. And I begin to see, it's early days, it's probably going to take me a couple of years to finish that, between the rise of ethno-nationalism, which is a phenomenon that is happening not only in the United States, it is happening in China, it is happening in Turkey, it is happening in India, it is happening in Hungary, it is happening in Poland. This ideology that people are not all equal, that certain individuals of a certain race, ethnicity, people who have a connection to the land for more generations than others, have superior rights to others. So what I'm interested in exploring is what happened to the commitment to global citizenship education and to climate change in those regimes. I can tell you that when I serve on UNESCO's Commission on the Futures of Education, we spent 3 years developing a framework for education for the next 10 or 15 years. We concluded that the commitment to universal human rights that existed in 1948, when the Declaration was adopted, is not expressed by many governments. There are some who study this topic very deeply who say, if we had to approve the Declaration today, maybe we would get 10 of those rights to be approved. And I worry about the evolution of a world in which we are less committed to the fundamental equality of all human beings than we were at the end of World War II. And I worry in that sense about what is happening in the United States, as well about what is happening in China and in India and in many other societies around the world.
We have one question from Shannon, and then we'll have one question from Master Helen. Yeah, maybe we'll take it together, yeah.
I'll try to make this as quick as I can. In your talk a little earlier today, you talked about the gap between policy and implementation, about education policy. And I guess a concern that I have by pushing AI in here in Malaysia and around the world, there's this big push to adopt AI, everyone needs to get AI literate, is that the best of intentions of that policy for productivity and efficiency and building extra capacity will not result in the way that you're explaining how you want AI to be used. It's going to be used as an excuse to downsize different departments. It'll be used as a way to bypass critical thinking and innovative thinking. How can we ensure that AI becomes the tool we want it to be and is not just the next buzzword or thing that we're all getting pushed to use without critically thinking about it?
If I may, we'll take the second question as well, if you don't mind. Thank you.
That means I'm going to have to remember 2 questions at this time. Why don't we do one at a time, because my short-term memory is limited.
Okay.
So thank you for that question. I want to be very clear. I am not pushing anything with regards to the AI other than democratizing access to knowledge about what AI is, what it can do, its possibilities, and its risks. I do think that the conversation about AI is too important to be left alone to corporations that sell AI and to governments. It is a conversation in which every citizen has to participate on the basis of knowledge. And so the only thing I'm trying to do with that book is to share as widely as possible, that's why it's open access, what we know about how AI is being used in education. You know Malaysia much better than I do. I do not know whether AI should be used, will be used, or how it will be used. What I did say in that lecture, for those of you who were not there, is that a real challenge of many public education systems in the world, including in the global south and probably also including in Malaysia, is that as governments realize that they have to expand the ambition of their educational goals, the gap between those goals and the reality that students experience in the classroom becomes more visible. And that one explanation of that gap that has not received sufficient attention is understanding the people who work in the middle tiers of management, not the school teachers, which are finally now understood to be hugely important, not even the principals, which are recognized to be as important, but everyone else between the school principal and the office of the minister. And I know from experience, and I share some examples, that programs to build the capacity of that middle tier have extraordinary results in terms of helping systems execute its intentions. I think that in that task, the first order of business is not to bring AI. The first order of business is to find a university who will have a commitment to build that capacity. And I gave an example of a program in Brazil that we developed in partnership with a public university that created a program that has now educated thousands of practitioners that produce what some people call the miracle of Sobral. Sobral is one of the highest poverty municipalities in the northeast of Brazil. It used to have, when we began this program 15 years ago, the lowest levels of academic performance in the entire Brazil. And now it has, controlling for the socioeconomic background of those students, the highest levels of performance. It is an outlier. And there are people trying to figure out what is the miracle of Brazil. There is no miracle. The miracle of Brazil is that you build institutional capacity. That's it. And so the point I was trying to convey was that it's very important to build institutional capacity and that universities have an important role to play in doing that. I think AI can be a tool to ensure consistency of quality across settings at scale. But whether that will happen in Malaysia or it should happen, I'm not qualified to know. I don't know the system.
Okay, Helen, there's a mic. Going to you.
Thank you. I'd like to build on a question that Professor Dato Lee asked a moment ago about what assessment is for, and the question that Richard Saldana asked about what fair assessment is, if not examinations. And it really struck me that there are, in policy terms, two key purposes that assessment is playing. One is the fair allocation of places in a competitive environment, and the other is the fair allocation of public resource to institutions and therefore to individuals who gain those places. It struck me when you gave your example about assessment that you were giving it in a postgraduate course, and it makes total sense to me that the students have already established their credentials to join that institution, Harvard, and who are doing public policy, that they are being assessed in a way which is consonant with the next stage of their career, and therefore they will be allocated fairly as a resource. But I'm going to challenge you again, if you don't mind, because I educate 7 to 18-year-olds. What does fair assessment look like if you are 16? And I give that example because in Britain, any move to abolish exams for 16-year-olds runs into the sand because 64% of UK pupils move institution at 16. And there has to be a way of deciding who moves where and which institutions get what.
Now I understand the question. So you're talking about how do we determine who should have access to universities?
I'm asking, no, I am, but I'm saying if not exams, then what? And is there anything fairer than exams in an age of AI with all the conversations that we've
Let me speak to the question. So in the United States, standardized tests to access universities began between World War I and II, when a Harvard president looked around our campus and saw only white, Protestant, upper-class men. And this was a time when the world was debating between three competing projects: fascism, communism, and liberal democracy. And he said, what we're doing here is a little closer to what Hitler has in mind than to what Jefferson had in mind. Because basically, access to this university is predetermined at birth by your class, your religion, and your race. And he then made a case for examinations. He said, I want us to admit people on the basis of demonstrating that they have the skills to access a Harvard education. That idea caused a revolution at the time when it happened, because most faculty said, you're going to admit the riffraff, you're going to admit people who are not qualified to Harvard. But it did change Harvard for the better. That president realized that it wasn't just an examination. You then had to think about what kind of supports do you offer. You offer working class children who have done well so they can be at Harvard. And so he created scholarships, which we didn't used to have. And he was so successful that he created the General Examination Board, and ever since we're using SATs. What we now know is that the most direct predictor of the SAT is the level of education of your parents. So to some extent, the examinations that we use right now are highly correlated to the level of social and economic capital of your parents. And that is the reason most American universities do not rely exclusively on the SAT. They use multidimensional assessments. At a minimum, they look at three things. They look at the cumulative performance of students in their high schools. They look at the SAT, and they also look at whether the student has challenged themselves in taking the most challenging courses available in their high schools, knowing that those vary. So if you're in a school that only offers 3 advanced placement courses, and you have taken them, you get more points than a student that is in a school that offers 12 advanced placement courses and has taken 3. Both have taken 3, but the context is different. There's also been at Harvard an understanding that it's important to try to assess not where students are at a point in an exam, but how have they played the cards they were dealt with. I will give you an example of what that looks like in practice. I have been on admissions committees in my school for 30 years. I remember a student, a Maasai from Kenya, who was the first person in his family to have gone to university. He narrated his journey. He went to school by accident at a time when Maasai children did not go to school. The government passed a resolution that mandated every family to send one child to school. His older brother was chosen and he hated it. He escaped, so the police came back. And to save his brother, he volunteered to school. Tended to be very good. He received a scholarship to go to a high school, and then he went to college. His grades were not exemplary, but he had the ambition of being the president of Kenya, and he articulated the ambition of being of service to the Maasais. He had, at the moment that he had applied, already created projects where he was funding the creation of water wells in his schools. And we admitted him. And I remember the discussion when people said, but his GRE score on the quantitative component is very low. And one of the requirements in that course is that students had to take an economics course and they had to take an advanced statistics course. And we said, how is he going to do the work? And I remember saying, given what this guy has done with what he was given, there is no question in my mind he's going to be a leader. And we admitted him. I don't know what grade he took in microecon. I suspect it was not an A. But Joseph was eventually elected member of parliament in his country. He has been a member of parliament for many years. He has probably done more for the Maasai people of Kenya than many people. He was the first Maasai we admitted at Harvard. If we had only based admissions on the GRE, Joseph would not have been admitted. So we did look at a number of indicators. I'll give you another example. We admitted an Afghan student who had begun his education under the Taliban in a madrasa school, who became a refugee in the UK, and who managed through a lot of hard work to end up at Oxford University. And his grades were not stellar. If we had only looked at grades, we probably would not have admitted, even though it was Oxford. But again, we looked at what he had done with the cards he had been dealt. He had worked helping other refugees resettle, and we said, Mohammed is a leader. So the question of what is fair is a complex question because that depends on what you're trying to do. In our case, we're trying to prepare people for leadership roles. And we believe it is very important to have in leadership roles people that represent broadly different segments of society in different countries. We believe it is good for the world to have Maasais who are educated, to have people who have gone to school under the Taliban educated, and therefore we don't only base the decisions to admit students on a single indicator, but in as many as we possibly can.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your wonderful questions and thank you for your wonderful response, Professor.